The time is now. Season 2, Dr. Bob Sports Podcast. I am Tanner. I am our head of analytics, and I'm in my 8th year working alongside Bob to originate our NFL and college basketball bets. And today, as always, I'm joined by our digital media specialist, Grant. We're back.
Yes, we are. We are finally back, and it has been a long 5 months since that Super Bowl, but we did do that little March Madness podcast special, but it feels good to be back talking football again.
Yes, it does. And this season, for our preview podcast, we're going to go ahead and combine all the fantasy advice and futures bets into each divisional podcast, releasing every Friday up into the season. And we're going to start today with the NFC East.
Yes, we are. So let's jump right into the NFC East. And the first team we are going to talk about are the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles are coming off of that 11-6 season. And don't forget, this team started last year 10-1, and then they absolutely fell apart. They lost 5 of their last 6 to end the year. And then remember, they got blown out in the playoffs, 31-9 against Tampa Bay. So 2024, we've got a new year. Sirianni is still here, but we got that rare double coordinator change. So the win total set at 10.5, and we're getting some action on the over.
Yeah, and let's start with the offense here in Philadelphia. Kellen Moore is now calling the plays, and GM Howie Roseman surprised by paying for a top-of-the-market running back this offseason in Saquon Barkley.
Yeah, and Jalen Hurts was quoted saying that 95% of this offense is new. So what are you expecting from Philly with their new coordinator here?
Well, I think Kellen Moore is going to be looking for answers against the blitz because that's what crushed Jalen Hurts last season. And one of those answers might be throwing to Saquon Barkley. We saw the Eagles finished last with only 12% of targets to running backs in 2022. And last season it bumped up to 18%, but that was still below average. So, as teams play more cover two high shells against the Eagles, we could see them looking for answers. Something we saw the Chiefs do in the past few years, throwing screens. Patrick Mahomes led the league in screen rate last year, and we could see Jalen Hurts throwing the ball to Saquon Barkley out of the backfield.
Yeah, and we saw Barkley running behind that horrible line last year, but how was he in those stats that we can really isolate for just him?
Well, Barkley wasn't great in tackles, missed tackles forced, but he was excellent in his vision. He ran for 0.3 rush yards over expected based off the blocking he got last year. That was a half yard per carry, better than what the Eagles got from DeAndre Swift and Kenneth Gainwell, who were terrible in that metric. I mean, you look at DeAndre Swift, he was expected to gain 4.7 yards per rush based on the blocking he was getting. That was a full yard per rush more than Saquon was expected to get behind the Giants' offensive line run blocking. So I don't think the most likely outcome, because of a drop in offensive line play, which we'll touch on in a moment. I don't think the most likely outcome is that Saquon is going to rush for 5 yards per carry, but we could see that with his elite vision behind Philly's offensive line. He's still a borderline top 5 running back in my eyes, and I think Kellen Moore is going to try and get him the ball on the ground and as a receiver.
All right, so speaking of Kellen Moore, what do you think about him in general as a play caller?
I think he's an average-ish play caller. I mean, his big bugaboo the past few years has been developing a ground game, particularly late in the season. But I think he's going to be getting a lot of help in that department from run game coordinator and one of the best offensive line coaches in the NFL, Jeff Stoutland. So I think Kellen Moore was brought in to help evolve this passing game because it just got stagnant last year under coordinator Brian Johnson. I think Moore will be able to do that. I certainly think he is an upgrade over Brian Johnson. So I don't think Moore is in that elite class with, McVay and Shanahan, but I think he is an upgrade for this Eagles offense.
All right, well, let's look at this offensive line. I mean, they are losing a Hall of Fame center, but they already drafted his heir apparent, former Husker, Cam Jurgens. So do we think the tush push is going to suffer without Kelsey, or is this more of a Jalen Hurts, thunder thighs, that's why it works?
Well, that's a critical question to answer. And sometimes you have to parse through Warren Sharp content, but I thought this was really good from his preview on the Eagles. He wrote that the Eagles have gained more EPA from tush pushes the last 3 seasons than every other team's total rushing EPA. In fact, 60% of Philadelphia's rushing production has come just from Hurts sneaks the last 3 years. So I don't think they're going to have that kind of astronomical success without, Jason Kelsey pulling his hijinks where he would always move the ball past the first down marker before they even snapped it. But I do think that Hurts being the strongest, lower half of the body quarterback in the NFL, it still makes them a very, very dangerous team in terms of short yardage rushing. So I think they're going to be, one of the best in the NFL in that category, but not so much better than the rest of the NFL.
All right, so we know that Kelsey's being replaced by Jurgens, but the new face on this line is Tyler Steen. What do you think about him?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Jurgens bumps over to Stinner. Steen is going to play that guard position, and third-round pick last year. He had a bad rookie season in limited snaps. He surrendered a 14% pressure rate, so they'll need him to be better for this offensive line to remain top 5 in the NFL. And if this offensive line, even if they can remain top 10-ish in the NFL, I think they can be pretty good. I mean, you look at the offense was rated market top 5 in 2022. Last year that dipped to top 10. And I think, bringing in Saquon Barkley to give them more answers against the blitz, Kellen Moore being a better play caller than Brian Johnson can make up for some of the gap for the loss of that Hall of Fame center retirement. So they're not amongst the league's elite offenses, but they're clearly in that next tier to me alongside teams like the Texans or the Rams.
All right, well, let's take a look at their defense here. They're coming off of a slightly disappointing season for their standards, and now they've lost guys like Kevin Byard, Nicholas Morrow, Hassan Reddick, and Fletcher Cox.
Mm-hmm. And those last two are huge. I mean, that's 109 pressures out the door with the Fletcher Cox retirement and trading Hassan Reddick. Now, they bring in Bryce Huff. He's basically just been a pass rush specialist thus far in his career. He played 43% of his snaps on third down last year, which, I mean, if you know it's going to be a pass, that is going to help rushing off the edge. He led the NFL with a 22% pressure rate last year, and he led the NFL in pressure rate in 2022 with a 26% pressure rate. But, if he becomes more of a full-time player, does that dip his production? I would say yes. The question is how much? Can he be as good of a player as Hassan Reddick? Probably not. But, I mean, if you just look at his rate stats, he's been one of the best pure pass rushers in the league. Now, let's shift to the interior. How are they going to replace Fletcher Cox? They need Jordan Davis to step up as a run defender. Davis was just average in run stop rate last year, but he needs to be a tank in the middle there for Philly to solve their run defense issues that we saw. They just were not physical enough last year. And then as a pass rusher, Jalen Carty certainly showed the ability to be as good as Fletcher Cox as a pass rusher, but he tapered off in the second half of last season. So the Eagles will need him to show that he can last for a full NFL season.
All right, well, let's look at the Eagles' cornerback depth here because it might be the best in the NFL, even if they move on from James Bradbury, because they just use their top 2 picks at that position.
Mm-hmm. And they already have Darius Slay, who made a Pro Bowl in 6 of the last 7 seasons. We think Avonte Maddox is a solid veteran competing for snaps at nickelback and safety. And then I think Isaiah Rodgers comes in really underrated. That was a great pickup for Howie Roseman coming off the year-long gambling suspension. He was 9th in successful coverage over expected, and opposing quarterbacks wanted nothing to do with him in 2022 as he conceded a league-low target rate into his coverage. There's a lot of buzz coming out of minicamp for Kelee Ringo. He's certainly athletic enough, and he's still young, so he could be competing for snaps at cornerback for the Eagles. They bring back C.J. Gardner-Johnson at safety, who led the NFL in interceptions in 2022 with the Eagles, but really the best sign for this secondary is the Eagles bring in Vic Fangio, a top 5 defensive coordinator in my eyes. And when you wrap it all together, I think the Eagles should be top 10 on both sides of the ball this year, and they'll be competing for the Lions for the second best team in the NFC.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did not hear you say Dallas in that mix, but let's take a look at them. So the Cowboys are coming off of that 12-5 season. They won the NFC East. They got the 2 seed, but their defense, remember, got absolutely embarrassed in that first round loss, 48-32 by Green Bay. So 2024, we've got a win total at 10.5. And the market is expecting Dallas to take a step back because it was a little bit of a disappointing free agency. But you got to remember, they didn't really lose much from a team that was rated near the top of the market last year.
Yeah, I think people kind of forget how good of a regular season team the Dallas Cowboys are. They were rated 6 points better than average in market last December. They were 4.5 points better than average in December of 2022. And basically the only big time player gone is left tackle Tyron Smith.
Yeah, and I think some people would argue with that a little bit because Tyler Biadasz is also gone.
Yeah, that's worth mentioning. I mean, this whole offensive line could take a dip, losing 2 starters there. Biadasz was 14th in PFF run block grade amongst centers last year, and he was 5th in pass blocking efficiency on true sets. So as far as I can tell, the Cowboys are going with Brock Hoffman, undrafted 2 years ago. He projects to be one of the worst centers in the league, probably about a half point worse than Biadasz, although Hoffman would be protected by possibly the best guard tandem in the NFL in Tyler Smith and Zach Martin.
All right, well, let's circle back to Tyron Smith. What is their plan at tackle here?
Well, it seems like the plan is to go with first-round rookie Tyler Guyton, who could be awful or could be great. We've kind of seen the gambit from recent first-round rookies coming into the NFL. We saw guys hit right away, like Rashawn Slater or Andrew Thomas. You know, they looked like a missed year one, but Thomas has developed into one of the best tackles in the NFL after he got kind of his legs under him, or could be a complete bust. So Tyler Guyton is probably the X factor for this Cowboys offense. How good he is really depends on how good this offense is going to be.
All right, well, another concern here is that this defense lost a lot of depth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was already a bad run defense, and they lose backup interior defenders Jonathan Hankins and Neville Gallimore, who were accounting for 1 run stop per game. And then you look out on the edge, they lose Dorrance Armstrong and Dante Fowler, who combined for 70 pressures. So DeMarcus Lawrence is going into his age 32 season. He likely gets just about half the snaps for this team. That's the reason they went out and got Marshawn Kneeland in the second round.
All right, well, let's look at the big change on defense here. It's actually at coordinator with Dan Quinn taking the head job in Washington.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think Mike Zimmer is a downgrade. I expect him to be one of the better defensive coordinators in the NFL. He's so good. He lasted 8 years in Minnesota despite so much suboptimal decision-making on the offensive side of the ball. The Vikings had an average defensive finish of 11th despite playing their home games in a dome. And that makes a huge difference. Mm-hmm. It makes such a big difference. I mean, Grant, what do you think the Saints finished last year in offensive scoring?
I mean, I don't know, maybe 20th?
They finished 10th. And I think people don't take into account just how much the environment, playing in a dome, factors in to coaching. So the fact that Mike Zimmer had his Vikings as an average defensive finish of 11th, despite playing a dome, is extremely impressive.
Yeah, that's insane. I did not realize that. But talking about Zimmer here, he's also not going to get bullied like we saw Dan Quinn's unit last season. I mean, when these teams are playing that heavy personnel, you got the 49ers, the Bills, and the Packers in that playoff game. I mean, they just dominated them, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the Cowboys are averaging 142 rushing yards allowed in their last 3 postseason losses. Dan Quinn's unit was really just built to stop 11 personnel. And if you put heavier packages on the field, the Cowboys got dominated, like you said. If you classify Marquise Bell as a safety, and I do, he's 205 pounds, the Cowboys played dime on 61% of snaps. The next highest in the NFL was Pittsburgh at 23%. Just insane how light of personnel they were playing. Now, they're going to fix that this year. They bring in Eric Kendricks at linebacker to play alongside Damone Clark, and they're just not going to be so small this season.
Yeah, and they also didn't bring back Jerron Kearse, who's a 215-pound safety. He lined up in the box 44% of his snaps last season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Zimmer's going to try and run as much 4-3 base as he can. Now, when they get into passing situations, you're going to see that nickel double A gap look that Zimmer has had so much success with. They're primarily going to run press man coverage on the outside, which should suit these Cowboys cornerbacks. So I think Zimmer's number one priority is going to be getting tougher, stopping the run. And I expect them to do that, especially if they can get a second-year leap from last year's first-round pick, Mazi Smith.
Yeah, that defense will be scary if they're stopping the run because they got those ball hawk corners out there. But where do you have this team rating at?
Well, let's say this offense drops from a top 5 unit to outside the top 10, just due to those question marks on the offensive line.
Mhm.
But the defense is clearly top 10 to me. It's more fragile, and they lose all that depth that we talked about. But at full strength, this is a really good defense with a really good coordinator. So that puts Dallas at about 2.5 points better than average to me. Still one of the best teams in the NFL.
Yeah, and I think they got a little bit too much hate this offseason with they didn't resolve the Dak contract, so now his cap hit's going to get up to 55 mil.
Yeah, that's a failure for them. But it doesn't really hurt them too much this year because remember, they still have CeeDee Lamb on his 5th-year option and Micah Parsons is still on a rookie deal. So there's a lot of talent on this Cowboys roster this season. In the future, the Cowboys might need a full reset when we're talking about them next summer. But for just this year, the Cowboys could be another great regular season team again.
The window is open. Well, let's talk about our next team. We've got the Commanders. They're coming off of that 4-13 season. And remember, they started 2-0, but then they would go on to lose 13 of 15 games, including 8 straight to end the season. But they got a new coaching staff, a lot of new faces in the building, and a potential franchise QB. So fresh start 2024, win total set at 6.5.
But they really didn't make a ton of splashes this offseason like they could have to support their new rookie quarterback. It's a lot of replacement level guys out there. I mean, they're 3rd in cap space remaining. Jaden Daniels is on a rookie QB contract, and he's the 5th highest cap hit on this team. For comparison, Caleb Williams is making more than Daniels, and he'll be Chicago's 10th highest cap hit. So there's just not a lot of guys to support this young rookie.
No, but it is a big change because they brought in some real NFL players that aren't going to be embarrassing to put on the field, which was not the case, particularly at edge last year once they traded Young and Sweat.
Yeah, I mean, Dorrance Armstrong, Dante Fowler come over from Dallas with Quinn. They bring in Cleveland Farrell. Those guys weren't starters last season, but they're capable NFL players, and they will be better than what they were getting on the edge in the back half of last season with Casey Toohill and James Smith-Williams.
Yeah, and we talked about Tyler Biadasz earlier in that Cowboys segment, but he's a solid center, not a needle mover. But what do you think about the moves they made on defense?
Well, they bring in Bobby Wagner, who's been an All-Pro for 10 straight seasons. It's an amazing accomplishment. But this is his age 34 season. So, he could drop off the age cliff this year, or he could be giving you another All-Pro season. Those kind of guys are tough to peg. But to play next to Wagner to support him, they bring in Frankie Louvu, which won't force them to put as much Jamin Davis on the field. That'll be a big help. At safety, they bring in Jeremy Chin. He's basically Cameron Curl's level, so a like-for-like switch there. But Michael Davis at cornerback is a big downgrade from Kendall Fuller, who finished 9th in PFF coverage grade last season, the lone bright spot in that secondary.
Yeah, when we're looking at this depth chart, it just doesn't feel like they've got a bunch of difference makers out there.
Yeah, and this coaching staff certainly isn't going to be raising this level of talent either, bringing in Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury. I mean, last year we saw the Rams have so much success despite having what looked like a ton of replacement level guys on their roster in training camp because of an elite coaching staff. We're not going to get that for the Commanders this year. They really don't have a ton of guys that can, challenge for an All-Pro team, even a Pro Bowl. There, you got the defensive tackles. You maybe like Cosme on the interior offensive line. We touched on Biadasz in the Cowboys segment. I mean, safeties and linebackers are fine. Terry McLaurin, certainly better than a replacement level receiver, but I just don't think you can make this team better than 3.5 points worse than average.
Yeah, well, the market's got him rated 26.5 point better than a team like the Giants.
And I really don't see much daylight between those two teams.
All right, well, let's take a look at the Giants here. So they're coming off of that 6-11 season, just a disaster year for them. Daniel Jones tore his ACL week 9. Then they had record bad O-line play. They allowed 85 sacks. That's the second most all time. So they're hoping for a new slate, and they've got a win total set here at 6.5.
Yeah, the Giants lost left tackle Andrew Thomas in game one, and it just went downhill from there. The offensive line was so bad. I just want to go back and take a look at where we were on this team heading into last season, because I don't know that you could take much away from a team that was signing guys off the street, playing backup guards at left tackle. I just want to focus on, what were we thinking when this was at least competent NFL players on the offensive line? And the market had this offense rated 22nd going into that playoff win against the Vikings. And then the hype train took off from there after they added Darren Waller last offseason. The market had them rated as an average offense heading into 2023.
Yeah, but then the wheels absolutely fell off, and now Saquon's gone too.
Mm-hmm. But they bring in two guys that can play on the interior offensive line in John Runyon and Jermaine Eliminour, and they bring over Jermaine Eliminour's offensive line coach from Las Vegas, who really had that line playing pretty well considering the talent. So I think that's a good signing and a good coach switch for the Giants on the offensive line.
Yeah, and we're getting to that time of the year where everyone's hoping that Evan Neal can make the jump.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that's another good thing about Jermaine Eliminour is he can play right tackle. He showed that with the Raiders. So if Neal's terrible, Eliminour can shift over there. But if Neal is better, finally, plays up to his talent, then Eliminour will be playing guard. Now we shift over to the receivers. They lose Waller, but they draft Neighbors. So I think this receiving group is going to be pretty similar to last year. I think Neighbors are going to be pretty good out of the gate. Mm-hmm. I just see this offense in that 25th-ish range due to the respect I have for Brian Daboll. Likely, and especially if they let Daniel Jones loose with his legs, since his career is on the line. I think he'll be scrambling any chance he can get to extend plays. He's averaged 32 rushing yards per game during his career, but I think I could see that spike to close to 50 yards per game this season with everybody fighting for their jobs.
All right, well, let's look at this defense here. They lose Wink Martindale and safety Xavier McKinney, but they bring in Shane Bowen and edge rusher Brian Burns.
Yeah, so McKinney and Burns play completely different positions at safety and edge rusher, but I'd say they're roughly similar in quality of player. Not all pro guys, but certainly in that next tier. McKinney conceded just a 52.1% passer rating into his coverage last season, and Burns is averaging 54 pressures per year since 2020.
What do you think about the coordinator switch, though?
Certainly different styles there. I mean, New York's blitz rate was more than double Tennessee's last season. Bowen's going to give you a lot more quarters looks instead of man, which should help the secondary, not leaving them out on an island as much. That said, I think Bowen is a downgrade at coordinator from Wink. Wink's kind of a top 8 guys in my eyes, and Bowen is in the tier below that.
All right, well, this secondary is going to be maybe the worst in the NFL, and they might be starting 2 day 2 draft pick rookies.
Mm-hmm. But the defensive line could be elite with the addition of Burns and a jump from Kayvon Thibodeau. It mostly went unnoticed since the Giants were so bad last year, but Dexter Lawrence had one of the best nose tackle seasons of the last decade. Even just the last 2 years with the Giants, Lawrence has 81 total pressures. No other nose tackle has 16 total pressures lined up as a nose tackle. So it's just insane the level of production they're getting from Dexter Lawrence. And if this pass rush can click, I think people's eyes will be opened on just how good of a player he's been recently for the Giants.
All right, so what do we do with a defense here that is so unbalanced in terms of the secondary and then the pass rush being so far away from each other?
Well, there's a lot of different ways it could go because the secondary could just be so bad that this defense is going to be bottom 5 regardless of the pass rush. But if you just look at quality of players and trust Shane Bowen to not be a terrible defensive coordinator, which I don't think he is, I'm going to put them in that range with Denver, about a half point worse than average. You look at, those two defenses, they both have an all-pro guy, even though different positions, with a couple of supporting pieces around them, and then the rest is just replacement level guys.
Let's switch it over to the fantasy corner here. Who are you looking to target in this division?
Well, I want to focus in on the Giants offense because I'm higher on them than the market. And I think they could get more shootouts than people think, especially when some of the better teams in the NFL start taking advantage of that awful secondary. And I love this coaching staff as well. So let's go through some of the potential options for New York from a fantasy perspective.
All right, well, you mentioned Daniel Jones as a possible target because you could see him running more.
Yes, I could. And I think Daniel Jones is going to outperform his ADP in the first half of the year. But if he does run more, there's an increased injury risk with that. And they'd have to pay him more contract if he gets hurt.
Yeah, and that signing thing is a little confusing, but I'll try to explain what his injury clause is here. So, 23 million of Jones' $30 million salary for 2025 was guaranteed for injury at signing. But if they decide he isn't the franchise guy, he needs to pass a physical before he is cut. So, if he doesn't pass the physical due to injury, the team will be stuck with a $23 million guarantee to him.
Right. So it's something like what we saw in Denver last season when they benched Russell Wilson down the stretch because they needed him to pass that physical before they moved on from him. So we could see Drew Lock play for the Giants at quarterback in the back half of the season, but I don't think Lock is much worse than Daniel Jones as far as keeping this offense going.
All right, so if you don't really see a big difference between those two, they should be firing no matter what. Who do you like at receiver?
Well, it's crowded. I think one of these guys is going to massively overperform ADP, but it's hard to say who, especially as we sit here before training camp in mid-July. I've got 6 guys in the mix at wide receiver after drafting Malik Neighbors. They've got him, Darius Slayton, Wan'Dale Robinson, Allen Robinson, Jalen Hyatt, and Isaiah Hodgins, who, remember, led the team with 9 targets and 105 receiving yards in that playoff win versus the Vikings a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that is a very full room there, but that does leave the running back room here. What do you see there?
Yeah, so that leaves the running back room and Devin Singletary, and I don't really see much behind Devin Singletary.
Yeah, I don't think there's very much behind him. I mean, they've got Eric Gray and Tyrone Tracy, who are just 5th-round picks.
Right. And Singletary is going as running back 34 on Underdog, but he should be getting a 75% snap share on an offense that we have rated about 25th. And Brian Dable loves Devin Singletary. He's quoted saying, Devin was a productive back when he was with me in Buffalo. He knows our system inside and out. Singletary had 50 targets in both years he was the starter with Dable in Buffalo. So I think Singletary finishes somewhere around running back 24.
Yeah, and that 24 or running back 24 territory, I mean, that's Jalen Warren. That's where he's going in best ball. And I wouldn't be surprised if Singletary outscores Warren this year. But let's end the podcast with a bet for the people. What do you got for us, Tan?
Okay, first bet of the year here in the NFC East. We're going with Commanders to be the lowest scoring team in the NFL at 25-1.
Ooh, does that mean you're not a Jaden Daniels guy?
Well, I'm going to stay open-minded about him. Maybe he's great out of the gates like last year's 2nd overall pick, and that would make this bet dust right away. But I'm just saying there's a wide range of outcome for a guy like Daniels. And let's lean into the fat tail that he also could be awful. I mean, he certainly wasn't consensus 2nd overall. A ton of people like Drake May more. And maybe we see that pressure to sack ratio catch up to him like Justin Fields. And this offense just hits the low end of projections behind a pretty bad offensive line.
Yeah, and we really don't believe in his supporting cast or Cliff.
Or really any of the offensive coaching staff on this team. I mean, you look, run game coordinator is Anthony Lynn. He's been fired. Pass game coordinator was Brian Johnson. He's been fired. Bobby Johnson is the offensive line coach. He was just fired last year from the Giants. This whole offensive coaching staff is just failed NFL coaches.
Yeah, I think the one concern with this bet is, I mean, you had Brian Robinson Jr. talking about how this new offense under Kingsbury is going from they had a lot of huddle last year, and now they're going a lot of no huddle. So they're going to try and play at a lot faster pace, and they might they might score a lot more points.
Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly if this team is the fastest paced offense in the league, they're not going to be the lowest scoring team in the league. But I think that's already being priced in here. I mean, you look at the market, the Commanders are listed with longer odds here than the Chargers and Justin Herbert based entirely on pace. And I'm not sure a defensive coach is going to let them play that fast all season long. I mean, Dan Quinn's defense gives up a couple of 30-point outings because the offense was going so fast, putting his defense back on the field too quickly. And we could see Dan Quinn pull the plug on this quick tempo, no huddle offense real quickly.
All right. Well, there you have it. First bet of the season is 25-1. Thank you for watching today. We will be back next Friday to preview the AFC East, and make sure to head over to drbobsports.com where we've got our NFL subscription and our college football subscription. So thanks for watching.